Hello, I'm Enrique Cerna, WSU Regent, along with WSU President Kirk Schulz, and we are going to have a conversation about the Pac-12 breakup and the impact on Washington State University athletics, also what it means to the institution. We're going to be talking about what happened, how it happened, and where we go from here. And Kirk, this is a tough time for Coug Nation. People are very upset. I know that myself, I'm a bit depressed. I'm a bit disturbed. I'm also kind of wondering what's ahead. So, where are we now? I know that things are fluid, but what's going on?
Yeah, things are fluid, but I think the future for what WSU or where we could be is starting to come into a little sharper focus. And I think anybody who's read a lot out, all the columns, I don't know about you, Enrique, but I wind up, anything that comes up on the Athletic or across the nation that, certainly involves WSU or the Pac-12. I've been reading pretty regularly over the last several weeks. And, I think we've really got we have three options that we're pursuing as Washington State University. And I think our fans, supporters, and people, none of these will be very surprising. One certainly would be to seek membership in the Mountain West Conference. One would be to seek membership in the American Athletic Conference. And then the third option would be to sort of reconstitute or rebuild the PAC. I'll say PAC X. Right now, there's 4 members left, but that could change literally within hours. And so I think each of those we're pursuing in a parallel pathway. And we want to evaluate what's going to be best for WSU, what's going to be best for our student athletes, what's going to be a good academic and athletic fit. And I think one thing I want to remind everybody is also, we want to be in a position where we control our own destiny as an institution and are not dependent on anybody else. And we want to be in a conference in a place where we can win conference championships. And look, I've put my heart and soul into the Pac-12 ever since I've been here as president. And I'm dismayed and upset and depressed about, where that has gone. But at the same time, I kind of can't sit here and go, well, let's just wait around and hope a lightning bolt strikes. We got to plan aggressively about what's the right future for Washington State University.
Yeah, we can be down about this, but we can't really let it overwhelm us. We have to move on. We have to do something here. So I think that that's one thing that most Cougs can agree. I think the bigger question is that what and how is this going to impact not only athletics, but the institution itself? Can you talk to that?
I think we're still figuring out, or we're still, guessing a little bit about what it's going to do. There was an article about, I think that John Canzano wrote, and he talked about, well, this was the end of sort of, the church parking lots in Corvallis and Pullman, getting money that they use for community things. And I have to remind everybody, regardless of conference affiliation, next August, we're still playing Cougar football. We're still going to have some teams coming in here. We're still going to have that same atmosphere, the tailgates, the RVs. It's still going to be an important part of our student experience. And I think there's a sense of loss. Well, but it won't be Oregon and it won't be Washington or whatever schools. But I just want to remind everybody, there are a lot of schools out there that are excellent universities that have really great athletics traditions and a very passionate fan base. And I think it's going to take some adjustment, but I think those things are still going to be there. I think there's a interesting question about, what this might do in terms of student interest and student enrollment. And, we've had really intriguing questions since you've been a regent with some of our faculty internally is, how much does the Pac-12 or did the Pac-12 affiliation assist us in recruiting students? And I think we never had really good data either one way or the other. So I think we're going to be working hard to remind everybody we're still a great academic institution, still got active Greek life in Pullman. We've got this, comprehensive Cougar experience, and that isn't going to change. Just the opponents and basketball and football and some of those may change, but it's not going to take away from what it means to be a Coug. And I think it's hard to see that today. It really is. But that's what we got to look at, is really look towards the future. So there's been some concerns about, well, this is going to really, really upset the entire university budget and things like that. The way we manage and run Cougar Athletics financially is it's a standalone unit. So there's not going to be, this idea that there'll be all these ripple effects across everything in the academic enterprise right now doesn't seem to be going to be as big a concern as maybe we thought 2 weeks ago. But we're just doing some of that analysis now, and we'll know. So I don't want to just simply say keep the faith, like everybody shouldn't worry about these things. I think it's okay to be angry. I think it's okay to feel leadership, including me as president, somehow let us down in the room and didn't get the job done to put us into a power conference the way maybe University of Washington or Oregon did. But we're going to need people to sort of come together around whatever solution. Be disappointed, but it's important that whatever conference we're in, I want us to be a dominant force in that conference, not just simply a member. And the way to do that is going to have people show up, cheer on the student athletes, and make sure that we keep that Coug experience a unique part of what we are.
You have talked to some of the student athletes. What have you heard?
Yeah, our student athletes, well, it is interesting that you even mentioned it, right? Because all these presidents and chancellors were saying things like, we've decided to do this because it's going to be better for our student athletes. And if people watch on social media, some of the schools that are going different places, some of the student athletes have maybe not necessarily agreed with those decisions and said, nobody ever talked to me about it or talked to us about it. And I just was determined that as we look forward on what we want to do, we need to make sure that we're actually dialoguing with the student athletes, and not a dialogue or asking them saying, well, here's the 3 constraints. We just said it's a blank sheet of paper. What is it that's important to you? And we really heard a couple things. So one was they said Power 5 or bust. We want to compete at an elite level, and we want to continue to make sure that WSU is competing at an elite level. And that came through 3 different meetings, loud and clear. The second thing was, interestingly, how are we going to be communicated with around this? We don't sort of want to read on social media what WSU is going to be doing. We want to be an important part of the conversation, and we want to know that we are heard. And heard doesn't always mean agreement, but that you need to take that into an account as we're making our decisions. So I appreciate our student athletes. They want to excel in the classroom. They want to excel in the field. They want to win championships. That's still going to be there. And we're going to have to determine the best option to get as much of that as we can.
What about the coaches?
I've left that to Pat to really be in Pat Chun or AD to be involved and engaged with the coaches. We've got several of the coaches that are in the middle of preparing for, volleyball, soccer, football. And I think some of them are treating this as nothing I can do about it. And I need to focus on winning a Pac-12 championship in my sport. I think others are, much more concerned about it. And so that's a conversation that I want to make sure that we have carefully, and our coaches need to weigh in, right? This isn't, again, a Kirk Schulz and Pat Chun decision solely on what recommendation we'll make to the board. It needs to be our coaches providing input, student athletes, our faculty, our staff, and our students all need to have a voice in what this is, because collectively, that's the group that's going to have to make whatever choice we make successful. And so people don't tend to maybe want to jump on the bandwagon if they haven't been part of the process or been heard. And so we're trying to do this in a way that has all those voices in the room, knowing at the end of the day, and Enrique, I just want to be upfront about this, not everybody's going to be happy with our choice. Whether it's coach, a student athlete, an alum, a donor, just a rank and file Coug, there's going to be people that go, well, that was a bad choice and leadership didn't do their job. And you got to be so comfortable that something controversial is never going to have complete 100%. Here's what we got to do behind it. And that's okay.
What about Pat Chun? I mean, Pat is name has come up in possibility of being the successor of AD at Ohio State. The AD there is going to move on. He's retiring. Of course, Pat is well regarded. We'd hate to lose him.
Yeah,
Well,
I of course, ever since Pat has gotten here and had some really nice success around fundraising and hiring really talented coaches and seeing our on the field performance improve and things, there's been every list out there, that goes hires a new AD, Pat's on the list. And so I think one, I'd worry a little bit more if our AD was never on anybody else's list. It's like, we have an up and coming superstar who's our athletic director. And so he's going to be on people's lists. We need his leadership during this time. And I know we've got it. Pat and I talked, I think one day during all this, we talked 17 or 18 times, right? We're just sharing information, you're working our networks. I think there are times that maybe our fans have felt I've been more diplomatic in my comments. Pat, I gave him lots of freedom to say, Pat, you don't have to be diplomatic at all. You're athletic director. You're looking out for our coaches and student athletes. You say what you feel you need to say. So all we can do is continue to, as Cougs, support him, support his leadership during what's going to be a pretty tumultuous year, I think, for Cougar athletics. And I'm not referring to the on-the-field performance, but, our budget's going to be smaller moving ahead, and that's going to require some tough decisions, and nobody's going to feel great about that. And we need Pat with us, and also recognize that he's a really talented guy, and we may not always have him as our athletic director. And Enrique, I'll take always 3 or 4 years of a talented individual, where it's a vice president, athletic director, coach, coming and making a really positive difference than saying, hey, we got to have somebody here's it for a lifetime. And so Pat tells me each day he's focused around the Cougs. He's focused around the right landing spot, listening to our student athletes and supporting our coaches and working with the university community. And that's where we're going to continue to focus.
I'm glad he's our guy right now. So let's get into what happened and why it happened. We'll go back to leading up to the meeting, August 4th. Is that the date that is right, I think? And you had expected the Apple deal to be reviewed and also approved on that day. Very quickly, tell me about the Apple deal, what they had proposed, why you thought it was good, reading the room. You had a deal?
Yeah, so my perspective was that trying to go to linear networks in general, the ESPNs, Foxes of the world, whatever, and expecting that somehow magically we were going to close the gap between where the Pac-12 was and where the Big Ten and SEC are in terms of revenue per school was going to require something different. I didn't know what that necessarily had to be. Right now we can look at and say, well, we would have taken a linear deal at 30 million and run with it. But, at the time, we're all trying to figure out how are we going to make sure our athletics budgets keep up with where, is it going to be a power 2 and a little 3, that type of thing. And so the Apple deal to me represented risk, clear risk, because maybe you're not on some of those linear channels as much. But if you said, what is the potential upside? It was clear that this was an opportunity to partner with probably the top technology company in the world worth over $1 trillion to say, let's try something new and groundbreaking. And we're going to partner with you on a 50-50 deal to try and grow this thing. And Apple felt within 3 years, we would vastly exceed where everybody else was but the big two and be closing that gap. So let's take some short-term pain maybe, but the longer-term gain looked really good for Washington State University. Apple also committed, they discussed with us in the contract, putting something like $100 million into the first year marketing this. Those of us who've been around a long time remember the genius marketing Apple has done again and again and again. And we all like to point out, well, what about the Newton? And what about this that didn't work out? There's, a few that didn't, but boy, their track record of success is really, really good. So I just like the idea of the partnership with the company, the focus around really promoting this thing, us getting a little skin in the game, opportunity to really do it differently. People can argue, well, streaming isn't today where it might be. I thought we were getting a little ahead of it, but that's okay. We needed something that was going to be different and really break the mold loose. So that was why I was supportive of the Apple deal. And
can I ask you one question about the whole
Sure.
thing about streaming and versus linear, which people talk about being television? And had you heard anything about what's the positives about streaming for the future versus television?
Yeah, we had some really convincing data that just talked about the number of people, and I'll use the term cord cutting, right, that are doing that. And then you start looking at generations and demographics. The current folks, for example, coming in as student athletes, they'll never have cable. They're going to do everything with a device, a piece of glass, whether it's an iPad or pick your favorite brand. And there was a sense
they're going to use this. They're going to use this. Your phone.
Yeah, and there was a sense that the people that wanted the cable thing are, sort of people look like me, 55, 65-year-olds that are used to growing up with cable, that are going to have it. Probably have family income enough that it's not a big part of your decision package on your bills, but that number is drastically falling. And so I felt, hey, we have we can get out in front of this demographic, and instead of somebody going on Sports Center, they would talk about, what can I do with my NIL deal? How can I get video content out to my peers and others using my phone quickly, seamlessly? And Apple talked about that, for example, in the Major League Soccer deal that they have, players come back to the locker room and there's already video teed up of their highlights that they can push out on their social media channels. And so I think, are we worried about just Sports Center? Are we worried about our student athletes going, hey, I've got an NIL deal, and look, I got this immediate content that I can be pushing out as kind of part of that? It was, again, looking ahead and showing some success. So we had a lot of data that showed that was where it is. But, it's also a fear factor, right? It's a risk. Maybe it doesn't work, and maybe, it doesn't do everything that everybody thought it would. I still think at the end of the day, it represented a really good deal. Now, my co-presidents in the room Thursday, even some of the schools that left, I'm for this deal. This is going to be great for our institution. We're going to work 100% to make it work. And, you sat there and said, okay, I think we got it, and it wasn't until the next day that obviously we didn't.
So let's go back. There was an article by John Canzano, another article that came out today as we talk, in the LA Times, that looked at the whole situation and what had happened leading up to it, kind of an inside look, and also named some names. That ESPN deal that they had offered earlier, I think we could have gotten 30 plus million per school with that if we had gone with that. Instead, didn't. Why not?
There was a lot of sentiment in the room. There was some sentiment in the room by some schools that said that's just not enough. And I think that was one piece of it. There was a lot of effort to say, is there a way that we can put a counter offer in front of UCLA that would have them, instead of ever leaving to go to the Big Ten, feel that the finances were such in the conference that we could find a way to get there, and make them a counter that would deal with some of their financial issues, still have them there, increase our market value. But that number had to be, above 50 million. So I think that's been reported in the LA Times article. I don't remember the exact details of all of it, but my sense in reading it prior to our conversation today is, as far as I remember, that's pretty accurate. So, that took some time. That took several months of going back and forth. And so I think what happened is we got a false sense of what we were worth in the marketplace. I think several schools had people on their own campuses that were running numbers and saying, hey, we're worth a lot more than $30 million. We're worth more than the Big 12, worth more than the ACC. we shouldn't sign something quickly. We need to make sure we're negotiating. And I think obviously you look back now, and of course we can all make better leadership decisions. We look back now and said, boy, that was a missed opportunity clearly, and really, really cost the conference dearly moving down the road.
Where were you on this?
You know, I think truly the Pac-12 for Washington State was the right place to be. We didn't have a lot of other options out there. And I felt the ability for us to associate with Stanford and Cal, Washington, these schools that are some of the best in the world academically, that it was worth 100% of my effort to say, this is where we want to be, and we want to be with those folks. It's easy for me to go back now and say, oh, I would have taken that deal. If some of the other presidents in the room said, hey, I'm ready to sign, WSU is right there, because we wanted stability and we wanted that group to stay together, because we just liked the association of those schools in the West and felt it was an opportunity for us to punch a little bit above our weight and to be associated with some of the best universities in the world. So I would have signed it and we would have been happy with it. But
the ESPN deal, you would have signed
it. Oh, yeah. But, people listening to this can go, well, of course he would say that now. But I don't think we were I know I can say I was not one of the ones, we got to get to, some other artificial number. We didn't have data and information. We had the data information being shared with the conference. And I think obviously we spent way too much time pushing our commissioner to negotiate when he didn't have a full set of cards to play with, in terms of, the data didn't support a value that some of the presidents and chancellors felt we had to have.
So in the LA Times article that came out today, as you and I are talking, it named names. It named the ASU president as the guy who actually said that he liked the Apple deal. And but he was the one that was looking bigger, and went back, even had one of his professors working on some info about all of this. Can you verify that?
Yes, Mike Crow, president of Arizona State, was certainly a proponent. But if you said Kirk Thursday, who was proponents, everybody was a proponent. I mean, there was nobody who said, boy, they're all saying the right stuff. But if I look and say, what university has been just extremely creative and been out of the box thinking, Arizona State under President Crow is just, that's in their DNA. So I'm not surprised that he was one of the real vocal advocates for saying, hey, look, this may be painful for a year or two as we're getting this set up, but a partnership of the Pac-12 with Apple in the West Coast. And guess what? All of the schools in the Pac-12, guess where a lot of our alumni work? At Apple and the technology industry. So it seemed like this just ideal marriage. And he was a vocal proponent of saying their risks, but the upside is so good, we really need to do it.
Yeah, but he did like the $50 million deal. He was pushing that.
That I don't remember. I truly don't. He was not one of the presidents I recall saying that. But, Enrique, I think we put out there, we met 30 times over the last 12 months. And so it becomes a little fuzzy sometimes when somebody goes, did this person support this at this meeting? And prior to that, we met 3 times a year, when you could remember pretty carefully, what anybody said or did. But it's a little bit hazy, to be honest.
How much blame on this? Because, there's been a lot of finger pointing here, even toward you, as to who messed up, who didn't read what was kind of in the room, or who could have, stepped up and said, hey, let's get this thing done. And that right now is really being pointed at the commissioner, George Kliakoff.
Yeah, I think it's unfair. It's a lot of the criticism, leveled at George, I think is unfair. And people can go, well, Kirk, you were influencing his hire, so of course you're going to say that. I think he stepped in with 2 hands tied behind his back. And the Comcast deal, just think of all these things that he inherited, had nothing to do with. And so, but at the end of the day, right, it's a shared responsibility for the debacle we're in. The presidents bear a role, and the whole board does. It's easy for me to point to President X, Y, or Z and say, they did this or wouldn't sign on to this. And the LA Times articles got all kinds of those details. But overall, were the presidents being strategic, and were they spending enough time? And I'm not talking about the 30 meetings, but prior to that, were the presidents spending enough time around strategic issues facing the conference? And I think the answer was obviously not. We were happy to go 3 times a year to the Bay Area and do our meeting and have a dinner and then go, okay, everything's fine. And probably more engagement should have been happening there. Did George and before him, the previous
Barry Scott.
read the direction things were going wrong? Probably they bear some responsibility there too. Did our media partners maybe negotiate necessarily always in good faith? I'm not sure that was the case either. And so I think there's plenty of blame to go around. And I think some of the articles that recently have come out that have been extraordinarily well researched, I think paint a pretty balanced picture of it was leadership, it was presidents, it was unrealistic expectations. And then, when we were talking about expansion anytime, there was also this sense of, almost elitism around schools that we might add. And I think that really, really also hurt any expansion. It'd be like, this school isn't quite good enough, good enough. And, so we wind up messing around sometimes instead of aggressively moving forward because there wasn't some perfect fit. And I think we watched what happened when the Big 12 went, there's not perfect fit. So let's go grab 4, schools like Houston and Cincinnati. And they worried a little bit less about that than the Pac-12 did. And I think that frankly hurt us because schools wanted to be in our conference, but we could not come to agreement that we wanted to expand. I will tell you, all along, I was a proponent of expansion. I just think you ensure survivability when somebody has a wandering eye if you have simply more schools. And if you're at 14, you lose 2, it feels bad, but you got 12 there. You start getting down to, as we did, 10, and then you got a couple wandering eyes. You look and say, boy, this thing can blow up really fast. And the world watched that happen on that Friday, 2 weeks ago on Friday.
Some of the articles have also pointed out in putting blame on college presidents not having enough background in sports management and dealing with media. And obviously you're brought in for the academic concerns, which you hear about all the time. Is that an issue, particularly in these times?
Yeah, I think it is. And this is my 15th year as a president at Kansas State, and then my 7 years at K-State, 8 years here. It requires athletics now requires more of a president's time by far than it did when I started as a president. It used to be you went to your conference, you sort of interacted with the other presidents, but I would say largely you were focused around the academic mission of your particular institution. The amount of time and buy-in that you need to take to be informed, not just simply show up at meetings, but really be informed, is very different now than it was. So I think most of us are trained, right, to do scholarly work and teach well and interact with students. And I think new presidents, when they start, or new chancellors, I say you got to have a strategic relationship with your athletic director. You may say, I don't want to deal with sports, or I'll let somebody else do that. Modern presidents cannot do that anymore. And you have to be really informed about the business of how it all works. And I don't mean how much you spend on lacrosse at your school, but I mean the business of ESPN, Fox, all those media partners. You can't show up 3 times a year and hope to be successful. So I think that has fundamentally changed, and that's not going to go away. There'll be continued reshuffling, but college presidents have to do that. And interestingly, Enrique, since you started me on this, I'm going to finish off with this, but it used to be too that most of the decisions financially at a university were made by the chief financial officer, and the president was dealing with other things. I've told people now, the president and CFO got to be like this. And it's not around just academic athletics. It's around academic enterprise and growing programs and all that. So it's a different skill set than the days of you're a business leader dealing with these really complex emotional things. And I think it just requires a different skill set.
It's like the coaches now having to almost become agents because of NIL and portal and all of
Yes.
that.
Yes.
How much blame do you take?
Well, if I'm a WSU fan, and I go, hey, my president was in the room and we're going to be at a different conference home and everybody else, seemed to find a place to land. Why didn't we? I think that's a fair, that's fair. I can't say that I wouldn't feel the same way. And I look at it this way. Look, I'm a Virginia Tech alum. I love WSU. Virginia Tech's where I went to school. If the ACC blew up and they were there, I'd be saying, where was the president and AD? What happened to my alma mater? So I think that is fair critique. I do think, though, it's been out there that I got gamed or was naive or whatever. I think if I was, and certainly Oregon State, the Stanford president and the Cal Berkeley president were all kind of gamed. And I don't think we were. I think we got caught up in a changing media landscape that valued highly successful football teams and big media markets. And we have a really successful football program at Washington State. We've been to 7 consecutive bowls, and we got a nice fan following and nice TV numbers. But Pullman, Washington is not seen as a major media market. And there's little me as a president or Pat as an AD can do to shift that dynamic of where things are. So I will always bear some blame. Interestingly, I had lunch with my mom. My mom and sister live in Spokane.
Did she blame you too?
Yeah, well, she said, well, it's interesting. Yeah, my mother's in her 80s, and she said, Kirk, I know you're getting a lot of noise right there, right now about this. And she said, at the end of the day, what is going to be most impactful to Washington State University is the work you've done getting funding for the medical school and those types of things. And she said, it may be hard to remember that, but you need to remember 20 years from now, that's going to be more important. And, I thought I'm eating my burger and have my beer. And I think, mom's pretty insightful sometimes about
yeah.
things. And I don't mention that to somehow deflect critique and criticism. I'm a leader at WSU, and when you do something great and somebody praises you, you also got to take the other side when maybe people aren't as satisfied with your performance. But I think at this particular point, it's really important for Pat and I and the Coug community to sort of roll up our sleeves and say, let's pick the right landing spot here. And once that's done, if people want to say, Kirk, it's time for somebody different, that's okay. But, right now we need more unification than we need divisiveness. And I think that's the regents, and you're one of them, when we're all sort of done, right? We got the budget size correctly. We got our landing spot and all that. I say we always take a look back and say, what should we have done differently? Do we have the right people in the right place at the right time or not? And then you develop an action plan based on that. But the middle of this, we got to stay together. Even though people are upset, we got to stay together. And that's going to be really hard. And it's going to be really important.
Do you feel betrayed by Oregon and Washington, particularly when, on that Friday, then you get this text, I think it was, from, I don't know if it was Washington or Oregon, maybe both, saying, we're going to the Big Ten?
That's a complex answer because, I think that I wished that my colleague presidents, not just Washington and Oregon, I think it's all of them, had been more forthright with each other. And look, at the end of the day, you all as a board, the fans, the donors, expect me to make the best decisions for Washington State. Guess what? The University of Oregon, the University of Washington boards expect their presidents to make the best decisions for their institutions. I would just wish that the two schools and others had been, we're really looking seriously at making this move. And we know it's going to be hard on everybody, but we feel we got to do that. And I just sort of felt going from one evening where we're all together to the next morning, literally 10 hours apart. I'm like, maybe a more forthright conversation a day or two before would have felt wouldn't have taken away the pain and the lack of options we think we may have, but it certainly would have felt maybe a little bit more like, okay, we're going to disagree on this, but we're still colleagues. And I just, going back, I just didn't like the way it all went down. So Betrayal, I think everybody's looking out for their best for their institution. I may disagree with the way that it happened, but I think people stopped, and I said this in a couple articles, I think the presidents and chancellors stopped being honest with each other. And I think that's sort of when stuff kind of unraveled. And I'll go back to when SC and UCLA left. I've heard countless number of times, well, you guys didn't do enough to keep USC. Well, hell, USC never said we're unhappy with this, or we think we should get extra money, or we should have this. If somebody tells you that, you don't act on it, and then there's consequences of that, and somebody leaves, you say, well, we made a choice, they made a choice, it's fine. When somebody doesn't tell you that, and then they make that choice, and everybody goes, well, you should have known it. My wife and I don't read each other's minds. If we don't communicate back and forth, it's hard to solve, challenges. And so there's just a lot of that in the last year and a half where people just weren't being honest with each other. And that really hurt.
Do you think this breakup really started with USC and UCLA leaving?
Oh, yeah, no question.
Yeah.
No question.
Let's talk about the TV people, Fox, ESPN, and particularly Fox. I think there's a feeling out there that those networks, sports networks, are hurting college sports because money is really driving all of this, and it's becoming, people concerned about the greed taking over. Your thoughts?
Yeah, there's been a lot of interesting articles written on this very topic over the last 2 weeks, and some that I thought were really insightful. I don't want to come across as hypocritical either, right? We're standing in line just like everybody else to collect that check, and if the check can be bigger, we want it to be bigger. So I don't want to sort of come across as holier than thou in this, because we were eager to see more dollars coming into support Cougar athletics. What I'm concerned about is the more you pull competition out of the marketplace, the easier it becomes for some of those funders to really, really call the shots. And I think now we're sort of down to really two dominant players that are really determining what happens with expansion. And I don't mean necessarily that any one of them's calling a commissioner saying, go get these two schools. Maybe that's happening. I don't know that. But what is happening if the commissioner calls them and says, we'd like to add X and Y, and they get to make a decision. Do I give a pro rata amount for that? Or do I say, sorry, we're not going to give you any money? I would argue, it's the golden rule. Whoever has the gold makes the rules. And I think that's where we are right now, is we've got just a couple networks that are making the real decisions about who goes where based on the dollars that they want to put into it. So I do think, though, that if I was Fox and ESPN, I'm not sure I want Apple in the marketplace, frankly. I don't want somebody with pockets that are that deep as a rival if I can afford it. And so I guess, was it a strategic move on their part to say, you know what, if we can kill the Apple deal, that gives us 5-6 years without them in college football. People can say, okay, Kirk, put on your tinfoil hat. That's kind of, conspiracy theory. But on the other hand, I could see making a business decision. I'm not talking about the value of the schools or any of that, that might be seen as pretty strategic to, have a more corner on the marketplace.
Yeah, I think when you're going to face someone like Apple that has the brand they do, that's a quite a challenge that's going to be happening there.
Yeah.
What where are we now as far as the potential impact of things uh, on our athletic department going forward? I know that you're crunching numbers. We're looking at the possibility of various things now. Uh, what can what are you doing to try to make sure that voices are being heard from people in the community and also from faculty as well? Because I'm sure, well, I know you're hearing it from faculty, and I'm sure that they raise a good question. The kids are coming here. I want them to get an education. Student athletes, not just to be an athlete, get a degree. You got a future. And their concern, which I think I totally get it, is that, hey, we're here to educate. So I imagine that you're hearing that strongly.
Yeah. Yes. And so we're hearing from a lot of different voices and groups. And right now, there's a lot of concern about just impact. People are unsure. What does this mean to the community? What does it mean to the university budget? What does it mean to recruitment? And I'm not talking about recruitment of student athletes. I mean recruitment of our classes and that come to Pullman, and that sports is is an important integral part of the Cougar experience at WSU Pullman. Those I hear a lot more of uncertainty right now about what does this all mean than I do almost anything else. That's part of the reason for putting together this group is not, and we were very public about who's on the group. This isn't meant to be some secret group that's meeting off on the side or
this is an advisory group, athletic
right.
advisory group.
It's an athletic advisory group specifically formulated for this. And it's got a couple sitting student athletes. It's got people like Jack Thompson, former football student athlete. We have a member, a leader of our WSU Everett advisory board, who's very active, and his son is a student athlete. We have the chair of the faculty senate on there, as well as some people from finance and the alumni association, the foundation. And the idea was to put together a group that represented a lot of the WSU community. And we're going to encourage them. We have our first meeting tomorrow. We're going to encourage them to be communicating with our regents representative, with your colleague regents, with the alumni association. We're not trying to do this in secret. We want people to use those networks out there. I still feel really, really important. We have two student athletes on there. They represent the other student athletes, but we also thought they need to see the options in front of us. They need to ask the tough questions. They need to understand and provide us some advice and counsel on saying, if we're in your shoes, here's probably what we would do. And so to me, I want to make sure that I'm hearing from a lot of those different voices and different communities about the next steps. And Enrique, we've had a couple of weeks of people firing off angry emails and letters to the editor, and contacting different influential people about the president and the AD, and this sucks and all that. And now we got to pivot to say, yes, it sucks, but we've got to make some decisions, and we don't have 6 months to mess around. So I think now we're going to be in a decision-making, data gathering, information gathering mode. And then Pat and I will make a recommendation to the Board of Regents about where we think we ought to be. And once that decision's made, we also want to have a communications plan out there about why we made this decision, what we think the benefits are going to be, and start getting the Coug Nation excited about maybe some new destinations to go to, athletic events and new rivalries and things like that.
Do you think there needs to be something done at the congressional level to deal with all of this stuff? Because, we talk about NIL, we talk about portal, we talk about what's happening here. Obviously, it's money. But it seems to have gotten so insane that it's almost this out of control type of situation. Some of it you can't, because it is money and there are corporations involved, but it just seems that it's not good.
Yeah, I think we've gone from a really tightly controlled environment that uh, did not provide the opportunities that student athletes deserved, to sort of now we've gone to so open, lack of any kind of regulations or guardrails or places for people to go for advice. I mean, it's now the Wild West, and there are some advocates that say, well, this is the way it should be. And, well, we're still working with largely 18 to 22-year-olds. They're finding their way through life. And because somebody has an NIL deal for $1 million doesn't mean they're going to make better decisions than somebody on an Olympic sports team that doesn't have an NIL deal. And I think I worry about not having some sort of guardrails. That I worry that our student athletes can get up with an unscrupulous agent, or if you don't know somebody that's been in some field, who do you go to for advice? I just think it's easy to say, well, it should be free for all and athletes should be able to do whatever they want to. I do agree. They need freedom to move between schools and pick the deal that works for them. But I also, at the end of the day, worry, what about getting a college degree out of all this? We can focus on the quarterback that's going to go play in the NFL and make $100 million. That's awesome. I hope they do that. But what about the 98% of everybody else that wants to compete at an elite level and leave with a degree because they're going to go into education or engineering or social work or whatever? And I worry about that. At the end of the day, is there a guarantee that if an athlete transfers to 3 schools, are they going to be the ones that go, well, I transferred to get better opportunities, I didn't get what I needed, and guess what, now I have a bunch of credits from 3 places and no degree? That's then they're going to go back to the universities and say, see, it's open, but you guys didn't do your job once again. So when we talk about regulation, Enrique, I think it's got to look at, where does a student athlete go to get solid advice? Their own coach is probably going to give them advice that's kind of focused on that school. Where do they go to get legal advice on some NIL deal? Or is there a clearinghouse for agents or whatever that, there's some ethical standards that they have to go by? How do we ensure that these young folks get degrees? At the end of the day, they got a college degree. And so I just think there's some of those things that if we're not careful, we lose. And I think it's going to be important to figure out ways to do that.
So as we wrap up here, let's go back to where we stand. Again, this is fluid. So by the time people see this, things may change already. But basically at this point, we're still waiting for Stanford and Cal.
We are. They, I've thought for the last week and a half that decision would come literally at any point, and it will. And I think that's why we're pursuing the 3 options I mentioned at sort of the top of this, is that if we put all our eggs in one basket and that basket falls apart, everybody goes, well, why weren't you doing anything else? And people can say, well, I can't believe we're considering this option or that option. Folks, we got to consider everything and give ourselves the opportunity to make that decision. And I'm frankly tired of us being dependent on what Washington and Oregon do, or what USC and UCLA do, or what Stanford and Cal do, is somehow that's going to dictate what we do as an institution. Maybe people go, Kirk, that's reality. I think we got to map our own pathway out, and we need to be making decisions about our future and not letting everybody else make those decisions for us. And does that mean maybe we're somewhere where we don't seem to be as prominent? That's okay. But at the end of the day, I want Cougs and Coug leadership making the decisions for around our student athletes and what is important to us as a university, not relying on somebody in the Bay Area or elsewhere. And we're going to just follow along because that's what we've always done. Time for us to stand up for ourselves.
It is. And I just want to say here, as we close, as Regent and as a Regent, I speak, I think, on behalf of all of my colleagues on the Board of Regents that we're concerned and we're paying close attention to what's going on here. Let's just say that the president and the athletic director, they hear from us, maybe more than what they would like, but that's the way it is, and they're going to hear from us. So we are very engaged in all of this, and we want what is best for Washington State University, for its students, the institution, student athletes, and all those alumni out there. So I just want to make that very clear. As Regents, we're tied into that. I'm going to give you one last word here. Anything last you would like to say?
Well, I just want to ask all the Cougs listening to this, we need you with us. And as I mentioned at one of our conversation points, it's, everybody now wants to, who's to blame and all that. And I got that. There'll be a time to go back and assess all those things. Right now, we've got to map the best pathway forward. And look, we're going to be in some conference. We're going to be in some configuration. And the last thing I want to have happen is we're there and people go, well, I'm just not going to support WSU anymore. And I'm not talking about writing a check. We need you to come out to basketball, to football, the things that you've always done, and not go, well, because we're going to have a different university playing us, we're not there. One of our selling points as an institution is that being a Coug is a special experience, and people have that kind of brand their entire life, and they feel passionate about it. So don't worry about the president and AD, but think about our student athletes. Think about that opportunity. Think about that opportunity for us to forge our own path. And let's come together around whatever we do. And we'll have plenty of opportunities for accountability conversations down the road. So thanks. And Enrique, appreciate the open conversation. And thanks for all you do. And go Cougs.
All right. Vamos Cougs, go Cougs. And thank you for your time.